She became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old, before she could even hold up her own head, let alone wear a crown. By age 5, Mary Stuart was ruling a kingdom, while most children were learning to tie their shoes. She was married off as a political pawn, widowed as a teenager, and spent her final years as a prisoner writing letters that would never save her. This is the story of a girl who never had a childhood, who was crowned before she could walk, and whose entire life was controlled by men who saw her not as a person, but as a chess piece in their deadly game of power. But here's what will shock you. The real mystery isn't how she died, it's whether she ever had a chance to truly live. Like and subscribe for more tragic tales of royalty's darkest secrets. The castle of Linlithgow echoed with the cries of a child, barely 6 days old, when Mary Stuart became Queen of Scotland, carrying upon her tiny shoulders the weight of a crown that was larger than her own head. It was December 1542, and the sudden death of her father, James V, had transformed a defenseless baby into the sovereign of one of the most turbulent nations in Europe. Mary did not yet know that she would become a piece in a deadly political game that would last her entire life, manipulated by men who saw in her not a child who needed protection, but a tool for their own plans of power. Her story is that of a girl who never had a childhood, who was crowned before learning to walk, who ruled before knowing how to speak, and who died young, surrounded by mysteries that still haunt the shadowy corridors of Scottish history. The Scotland of the 16th century was a land of misty castles and shifting loyalties, where powerful clans constantly fought among themselves, while England and France disputed influence over the small mountainous kingdom. Mary was born amid this turbulence, daughter of a king who had died of grief after the humiliating defeat of his armies by the English at the Battle of Solway Moss. James V had prophesied that the Stuart dynasty would end with a woman saying, "It can we a lass and will gang we a lass," referring to Marjorie Bruce, who had brought the Stuart crown to Scotland through her marriage. The king died believing that his newborn daughter would be the last Stuart to govern, not knowing that he was predicting not only the end of a dynasty, but the beginning of a tragedy that would consume the life of his innocent daughter. The coronation of Mary at 9 months of age was a ceremony that mixed royal pomp with tragic absurdity. The child cried incessantly, while the heavy Scottish crown was held over her head by lords who were already planning to use her authority for their own ends. The Earl of Arran, appointed as regent, smiled at the crowd while secretly negotiating with the English to marry the little queen to the future Edward VI of England, an agreement that would transform Scotland into an English vassal. At the same time, Mary's mother, Marie de Guise, an astute and determined Frenchwoman, conspired to take her daughter to France and marry her to the French Dauphin, thus ensuring that Scotland would become a French satellite. The child at the center of this dispute was nothing more than a symbol, a royal doll that would be dressed in whatever political clothes best served the interests of the adults who controlled her destiny. The early years of Mary's life were marked by constant attempts at kidnapping and assassination. When she was only 2 years old, the English invaded Scotland in the campaign that became known as the Rough Wooing, a brutal attempt to force the marriage between Mary and Edward VI through violence and devastation. Henry VIII's armies burned cities, destroyed monasteries, and massacred civilians in the hope of breaking Scottish resistance and capturing the little queen. Mary was hidden in Stirling Castle, where she lived as a golden prisoner, surrounded by armed guards who had orders to kill her rather than allow her to fall into English hands. She was a child who played with dolls while men died in her name, who learned her first words while entire cities were reduced to ashes because of her existence. The harsh reality of 16th century politics meant that Mary's very survival was a constant source of international tension. The English viewed her as the key to finally uniting the British Isles under English rule, while the French saw her as their gateway to controlling Scottish ports and using Scotland as a base for attacks against England. Neither side particularly cared about the well-being of the child herself. She was valuable only insofar as she could be used to advance their respective national interests. The little girl who should have been learning nursery rhymes was instead the subject of diplomatic negotiations that determined the fate of nations. The decision to send Mary to France at the age of 5 was made in desperation, when it became clear that Scotland could not protect her from the English. The journey across the tempestuous northern seas was a terrible adventure for such a small child, who spent weeks seasick in the hold of a ship while storms threatened to sink the vessel that carried the hope of Scottish independence. When Mary finally arrived in France in August 1548, she was a pale and frightened girl who spoke only Gaelic and English, completely lost in a court that spoke French and followed customs that were entirely foreign to her. She cried for her mother for weeks, but Marie de Guise had decided that the sacrifice of separating from her daughter was necessary to ensure her survival and Scotland's future. The French court of Henry II was a place of unimaginable luxury for a child who had grown up in the austere castles of Scotland. Mary was installed in the chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where she lived surrounded by a magnificence that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. Her chambers were decorated with tapestries that told stories of ancient heroes. Her dresses were made of silks imported from the Orient, and her toys were works of art created by Europe's finest craftsmen. But behind all this luxury, Mary was being carefully molded to serve French interests. She learned to speak French like a native, studied literature and music, was educated in the Catholic faith with a devotion that would become one of the hallmarks of her personality, and gradually began losing her memories of the wild Scotland where she had been born. The transformation of Mary Stuart from Scottish princess to French courtier was both remarkable and tragic. The French court prided itself on being the most sophisticated in Europe, a place where art, literature, and music flourished under royal patronage. Mary excelled in this environment, becoming fluent not only in French, but also in Latin, Italian, and Spanish. She developed into an accomplished poet, writing verses that displayed both technical skill and genuine emotional depth. Her musical abilities were extraordinary. She could play the lute, virginals, and harp with equal facility, and her voice was said to be one of the most beautiful at court. She became an elegant dancer, mastering the complex court dances that were as much about political messaging as they were about entertainment. Yet this cultural refinement came at a cost. With each passing year, Mary became more French and less Scottish. She adopted French mannerisms, French ways of thinking, and French perspectives on politics and religion. The wild, proud Scotland of her birth became increasingly foreign to her, remembered more as a collection of romantic stories than as a real place with real people who had real problems. This cultural alienation would later prove catastrophic when she returned to rule a country she no longer truly understood. The betrothal to Francois, the Dauphin of France, was announced when Mary was only 6 years old. He was a frail and sickly boy, a year younger than she, who suffered from health problems that made everyone doubt he would live to adulthood. But Mary was taught to love him as a duty, to see him as her future husband and the father of her children, without understanding the political implications of a union that would make Scotland a French province. The two children played together in the castle gardens, unaware that their childish relationship was being carefully orchestrated to serve geopolitical interests they were too young to comprehend. Francois was a gentle boy who was fond of Mary, but he also suffered from the constant pressure of knowing that his value as a person was entirely tied to his ability to survive and produce heirs for the French throne. The relationship between Mary and Francois was genuinely affectionate, perhaps the only truly innocent relationship of Mary's entire life. They shared the bond of children who had been thrust into adult responsibilities far too early, and they found comfort in each other's company. Francois, despite his physical frailty, was intelligent and kind, and he genuinely cared for Mary's welfare in a way that was rare among the calculating courtiers who surrounded them. For Mary, Francois represented safety and companionship in a world where everyone else seemed to want something from her. Mary's education in France was exceptional for a woman of her time, but it was also a sophisticated form of brainwashing that gradually alienated her from her Scottish roots. She studied Latin, Greek, Italian, and Spanish, became a talented poet and graceful dancer, learned to play several musical instruments, and developed a refined taste for art and literature. But at the same time, she was taught to see France as her true homeland and Scotland as a barbarous land from which she had been saved by French generosity. Her French tutors painted the Scots as semi-civilized savages who did not deserve to have such a cultured and refined queen, psychologically preparing her to accept that the best fate for Scotland would be to become part of the French Empire. This education had profound political implications. By making Mary thoroughly French in her outlook and sympathies, the French court was ensuring that when she eventually returned to Scotland, she would naturally favor French interests over Scottish ones. She was being programmed to see Scottish independence not as a noble cause worth fighting for, but as an obstacle to the civilizing influence of French rule. This psychological manipulation was perhaps more effective than any military conquest could have been. The marriage between Mary and Francois in 1558 was one of the most spectacular ceremonies of the 16th century, a celebration that lasted for weeks and cost a fortune that impoverished the French treasury for years. Mary was 15 years old and was considered one of the most beautiful women in Europe, tall and elegant, with red hair that shone like fire in the candlelight, and eyes that seemed to contain all the melancholy of the Scottish Highlands. Francois, now 14, remained frail and sickly, but had developed a genuine devotion to his wife that touched the hearts of all who saw them together. The young couple seemed truly in love, but their love was a delicate flower that bloomed in a garden poisoned by political intrigue and dynastic ambitions. The wedding festivities were a masterpiece of Renaissance pageantry, designed to demonstrate French power and wealth to the watching world. Tournaments were held where the greatest knights of France displayed their martial prowess. Masks were performed, featuring elaborate allegorical representations of the union between France and Scotland, and banquets were staged that featured exotic foods from across the known world. The cost was staggering, requiring new taxes that caused grumbling among the French people, but Henry II was determined to make a statement about the importance of this marriage alliance. When Henry II died in a tournament accident in 1559, Mary became Queen of France at 16, in addition to continuing as Queen of Scotland. It was a position of extraordinary power for someone so young, but also an overwhelming responsibility she was not prepared to carry. Francois VII was officially king, but his health continued to deteriorate, and Mary found herself at the center of a power struggle between different factions of the French nobility. She was simultaneously very powerful and completely vulnerable, a queen who controlled two kingdoms, but who depended entirely on older and more experienced advisors who frequently had their own plans for her and her territories. The death of Francois II in December 1560, just 1 year after becoming king, was the first major blow of fate in Mary's life. The young king died of an ear infection that spread to his brain, a sudden and painful death that left Mary widowed at 18. Francois had been not only her husband, but also her best friend and protector, the only person in her life who loved her for herself and not for her political value. His death left Mary completely lost, a young widow who suddenly found herself without position in France, where the new queen, Catherine de' Medici, saw her more as a rival than as an ally. France, which had been her home for 12 years, suddenly became a hostile place where she was no longer welcome. The political implications of Francois's death were immediate and severe. As a childless widow, Mary had no claim to continue as Queen of France, and Catherine de' Medici made it clear that she was expected to return to Scotland and leave French politics to the French. This was devastating for Mary, who had spent more than 2/3 of her life in France and considered it her true home. The prospect of returning to Scotland, a country she barely remembered and which had changed dramatically during her absence, was terrifying. The decision to return to Scotland in 1561 was made in desperation, but it proved to be an even greater tragedy. Mary had become a completely French woman in her tastes, manners, and perspectives, but she tried to govern a country that barely remembered her and that deeply distrusted her Catholic and French education. Scotland had become Protestant during her absence, led by reformers like John Knox, who saw Mary as a papal prostitute sent to destroy the true religion. The young queen found herself governing a country where her own faith was viewed as heresy, where her refined education was seen as foreign affectation, and where her youth and femininity were viewed as signs of weakness, incompatible with leading a warrior nation. The Scotland that Mary returned to in 1561 was dramatically different from the one she had left as a child. The Protestant Reformation, led by the fiery preacher John Knox, had swept away the old Catholic order and established a new religious settlement that was deeply suspicious of anything that smacked of popery. The elaborate rituals and artistic beauty that Mary had learned to love in France were seen as satanic corruptions by the Scottish Presbyterians, who favoured plain churches, simple services, and a stern moral code that left little room for the courtly pleasures that Mary considered normal. Moreover, the Scottish nobility had grown accustomed to governing without a monarch during Mary's long absence. They had divided power among themselves and had no intention of surrendering their newfound independence to a young woman who had been raised in a foreign court. They viewed Mary's French upbringing with suspicion, seeing it as evidence that she would try to subordinate Scottish interests to French ones. Her Catholicism was particularly problematic, as it aligned her with France and Spain against England, a position that many Scottish nobles thought was strategically disastrous. John Knox, the leader of the Scottish Reformation, was particularly hostile to Mary. He had written a tract called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, arguing that female rule was contrary to both nature and God's will. He saw Mary's return as a direct threat to the Protestant settlement in Scotland, and used his considerable influence to turn public opinion against her. Knox's sermons portrayed Mary as a foreign agent sent to restore popery and destroy Scottish independence, and his rhetoric had a powerful effect on a population that was already suspicious of Catholic influence. Mary's attempt to establish a modus vivendi with her Protestant subjects was largely unsuccessful. She agreed to maintain the Protestant settlement and to hear Protestant sermons, but she insisted on her right to hear Mass privately in her own chapel. Even this modest accommodation was controversial, with Knox and other reformers arguing that any toleration of Catholic worship was a betrayal of the Protestant cause. Mary found herself constantly walking a tightrope, trying to maintain her own religious convictions while not provoking her Protestant subjects into open rebellion. The marriage of Mary to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in 1565, was another fatal error that accelerated her downfall. Darnley was a handsome and ambitious young man who seduced Mary with his charming manners and impressive physical appearance, but who quickly revealed himself to be a cruel, jealous, and incompetent husband. He demanded to be crowned King of Scotland, not merely Prince Consort, and when Mary refused, he began conspiring against her with her enemies. Darnley was a man who had been spoiled since childhood, who had never learned to accept no for an answer, and who became violent when his wife refused to yield to his desire for absolute power. The marriage that should have strengthened Mary's position actually weakened it, because it associated her image with a man who was universally despised by the Scottish nobles. Darnley's character flaws became apparent almost immediately after the marriage. He was vain, petulant, and prone to violent rages when he did not get his way. He began drinking heavily and consorting with Mary's enemies, sharing state secrets and encouraging plots against his own wife. His demand for the crown matrimonial, which would have made him king in his own right rather than merely the Queen's husband, was particularly inflammatory, as it would have given him the right to rule Scotland even if Mary died. The relationship between Mary and Darnley deteriorated rapidly. What had begun as physical attraction quickly turned to mutual loathing as Mary realized the extent of her husband's character defects. Darnley, for his part, became increasingly resentful of Mary's refusal to grant him the political power he craved, and he began to see her advisers as obstacles to his ambitions. This resentment would soon turn deadly. The murder of David Rizzio in 1566 was the moment when Mary realized that her life was in constant danger. Rizzio was her personal secretary, an Italian musician who had become one of her closest and most trusted advisers. Darnley, consumed by unfounded jealousy, organized a conspiracy to assassinate Rizzio in Mary's presence when she was 6 months pregnant. The murder was brutal and symbolic, a demonstration that Mary had no real power to protect even those closest to her. Rizzio was stabbed 56 times in front of the terrified Queen, his blood spattering her dress, while the assassins shouted that she would be next if she continued to defy her male husband and advisers. The murder of Rizzio was carefully planned to be as traumatic as possible for Mary. The conspirators forced their way into her private supper chamber at Holyrood Palace, where Mary was dining with Rizzio and a few other companions. They dragged the screaming Italian from the room and butchered him in an adjoining chamber, making sure that Mary could hear every moment of his agony. The message was clear. Mary's foreign advisers were not welcome in Scotland, and Mary herself was not safe if she continued to rely on them. The psychological impact of Rizzio's murder on Mary cannot be overstated. She was pregnant and vulnerable, forced to witness the brutal killing of one of the few people she trusted. The trauma of the event may have contributed to complications with her pregnancy, and certainly left her with a lasting sense of insecurity. She realized that her own husband was willing to terrorize her in the most brutal fashion to get his way, and that the Scottish nobles were prepared to use extreme violence to control her behavior. The mysterious death of Darnley in 1567 sealed Mary's fate. The young lord was found dead in his house after an explosion, but the autopsy revealed that he had been strangled before the fire. Mary was immediately suspected of orchestrating the murder, especially because she married the Earl of Bothwell just 3 months later, the same man who was the prime suspect in Darnley's death. The marriage to Bothwell was Mary's final political error, a decision that made her appear guilty even if she was innocent, and that provided her enemies with the justification they needed to remove her from the throne. Bothwell was a powerful and unscrupulous man who may have seduced Mary or even raped her to force the marriage, but the society of the time blamed the Queen for the apparent impropriety of marrying so quickly after her husband's death. The circumstances surrounding Darnley's death remain one of history's great mysteries. The official story was that gunpowder stored in the basement of Kirkhoe Field, where Darnley was staying, had accidentally exploded. But the discovery of Darnley's body in the garden, apparently strangled, suggested a more complex plot. Various theories have been proposed: that Bothwell killed Darnley to clear the way for his own marriage to Mary, that Mary herself was involved in the plot, that English agents were responsible, or that other Scottish nobles orchestrated the murder for their own purposes. What is certain is that Mary's marriage to Bothwell was a political disaster. Bothwell was widely hated by the Scottish nobility, who saw him as an upstart adventurer who had gained too much influence over the Queen. The marriage took place according to Protestant rites, which offended Mary's Catholic supporters, but it was also viewed as hasty and indecent by Protestant opinion. The ceremony itself was a miserable affair, lacking the pomp and celebration that should have marked a royal wedding, and Mary was reported to have wept throughout the proceedings. The forced abdication of Mary in 1567, at age 24, was one of the most dramatic falls in royal history. The woman who had been queen of 2 countries, who had governed France and Scotland, who had been considered one of the most powerful people in Europe, was reduced to a prisoner in her own kingdom. She was forced to sign her abdication on the island prison of Lochleven, while her own subjects rebelled against her and declared her infant son, James VI, as the new King of Scotland. Mary had lost everything: her thrones, her freedom, her reputation, and the chance to raise her own child. She was a woman of only 24, who had already lived through more tragedies than most people experience in a lifetime. The circumstances of Mary's abdication were particularly humiliating. She was held prisoner on Lochleven Castle, a fortress on an island in the middle of a loch, from which escape seemed impossible. Her captors, led by Lord Lindsay, were determined to force her to abdicate in favour of her infant son. When Mary initially refused, they threatened her with death, making it clear that abdication was her only alternative to execution. The document she signed was brief and formal, but it represented the complete collapse of everything she had worked for since returning to Scotland. Mary's escape from Lochleven in 1568 was a brief moment of hope in an otherwise tragic story. With the help of sympathetic servants, she managed to flee the island prison and rally a small army of supporters. For a few weeks, it seemed possible that she might regain her throne, but her forces were decisively defeated at the Battle of Langside, and Mary was forced to make a desperate choice: return to captivity in Scotland or flee to England and throw herself on the mercy of her cousin. Elizabeth I Mary's flight to England in 1568 was her last desperate attempt to recover her power, but it became the beginning of her slow execution. Elizabeth I of England could not free her, because that would mean recognizing her claims to the English throne. But she also could not execute her without just cause, because that would mean murdering an anointed queen. Mary spent the next 19 years as a golden prisoner in various English castles, a woman who had been the most powerful person in Europe, reduced to writing melancholy letters and embroidering tapestries to pass time. She aged in captivity, losing her famous beauty and her health, but never losing her royal dignity or her hope of someday recovering her Scottish throne. The long captivity in England was perhaps the cruelest fate of all for Mary. She was moved from castle to castle, always under guard, always watched, never free to make her own choices. She was allowed a small court of servants and was treated with the respect due to a queen, but she was nonetheless a prisoner. The psychological toll of this captivity was enormous. Mary, who had been accustomed to wielding real power, was reduced to complete dependence on her English captors. During these years, Mary became the centre of numerous Catholic plots to overthrow Elizabeth and place her on the English throne. Whether Mary actively encouraged these plots or was simply a passive figurehead, is still debated by historians. What is certain is that her very existence was a constant threat to Elizabeth's security, as she represented a legitimate alternative to Protestant rule in England. This made her eventual execution almost inevitable, as Elizabeth's government could not tolerate the ongoing threat that Mary represented. The execution of Mary in 1587 was the inevitable end of a life that had been a tragedy since birth. She was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle on charges of treason, after being implicated in a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth II. Mary faced death with the courage of a queen, dressed in red to symbolize her Catholic martyrdom, forgiving her executioners and praying until the last moment. Her death was technically a legal execution, but in reality, it was the murder of a woman who had been a victim of the political ambitions of the men around her from the moment she was born. The mystery surrounding Mary's death is not in the circumstances of her execution, but in the questions her life raises about fate, power, and tragedy. Was she an innocent victim of male ambitions, or an active participant in intrigues that cost innocent lives? Were her political decisions the result of poor guidance or character flaws? Was she murdered for her crimes, or for her political inconvenience? These questions remain unanswered, but what is certain is that Mary Stuart was a child who never had the chance to truly be a child, a queen who never had the chance to truly govern, and a woman who paid with her life for being born at a time, and in a position where female power was seen as an aberration that needed to be corrected or eliminated. The story of Mary Stuart is also the story of how power corrupts not only those who exercise it, but also those who surround it. She was manipulated from birth by regents, advisors, husbands, and enemies who saw her not as a person, but as a symbol or tool for their own purposes. Her tragedy was not only personal, but representative of the condition of all powerful women in an age that was not prepared to accept that power could be exercised by someone considered naturally inferior. Mary died not only because she made political mistakes, but because her very existence as a powerful woman was seen as a mistake that needed to be corrected by death. In the end, Mary Stuart's life stands as a testament to the tragic collision between individual human dignity and the inexorable forces of political necessity. She was a woman of considerable intelligence, talent, and courage who was destroyed by circumstances largely beyond her control. Her story continues to fascinate because it raises fundamental questions about power, gender, and justice that remain relevant today. Mary Stuart was, in the words of one historian, born to trouble as the sparks fly upward, and her tragedy serves as a reminder of the human cost of political ambition and the particular vulnerabilities faced by women who dared to claim power in a world determined to deny it to them. Like and subscribe for more tragic tales of royalty's darkest secrets.